The letter arrived on the morning of my daughter-in-law's baby shower. I was sitting at the kitchen table, the one my wife and I had bought 31 years ago at an estate sale in Columbus, Ohio. My coffee was hot. I remember that because I noticed the steam curling up from the mug, and I thought about how quiet the house had become since my son moved out. That kind of quiet settles into a man differently when he's past 60. It has weight to it. The envelope had no return address, just my name, written in handwriting I didn't recognize. I almost set it aside. I almost let it sit there next to the sugar bowl until I finished my coffee and moved on with my day. I almost did a lot of things differently that morning. Inside was a single sheet of paper, a lab report, a paternity test. The child my daughter-in-law was carrying, the grandchild I had already started loving, was not my son's. I sat with that paper for a long time. The coffee went cold. I didn't touch it again. My son's name is Daniel. He's 34, works in commercial real estate, got his mother's patience and his grandfather's jaw. He met his wife, Renata, 6 years ago at a colleague's wedding in Cincinnati. She was the maid of honor. He was a groomsman. They slow danced twice and exchanged numbers, and 3 years later they were married in a garden ceremony outside of Dayton, with 112 guests and my late wife's rose bushes cut fresh for the centerpieces. My wife, Carol, died 18 months before Daniel and Renata's wedding. Breast cancer, diagnosed late, moved fast. She never got to see him marry. That absence sat at every table during the reception, quiet and uninvited, the way grief always does. I liked Renata. I want to be clear about that, because what I'm telling you now is not a story I take any pleasure in. She was sharp and warm, and she remembered small things. My birthday, the name of my cardiologist, that I preferred unsweetened iced tea in summer. She called me every Sunday for the first 2 years of their marriage. She sent cards at Christmas with handwritten notes inside. She made my son happy in a way I could see from across a room. I trusted her. That trust is part of what made the letter so difficult to hold. I didn't know who sent it. That was the first thing I turned over in my mind. Someone had gone to the trouble of getting a prenatal paternity test done, paying for it, and then mailing the results to me. Not to Daniel, not to Renata, to me. The grandfather, the old man sitting alone in a house in Columbus drinking his morning coffee. Why me? That question followed me for 3 days before I allowed myself to think about the next question, which was, what do I do with this? I'm not a man who acts quickly on hard information. I spent 30 years as a high school history teacher. I know that the most consequential decisions are rarely made in the moments of highest emotion. I set the lab report inside my copy of The Power Broker on the bookshelf. Carol always said I hid important things in books, and I made myself wait. I called my doctor. My blood pressure had been climbing since spring, and I didn't want what I was feeling to register as a medical event. He told me to take my medication, get some sleep, and stay off the internet. Good advice that I followed for exactly one of those 3 things. I found the testing company on the second night, BioVeritas Prenatal Services, based in Atlanta. I called their general number the next morning, Tuesday, and explained that I had received results in the mail that I believed may have been sent to me by mistake, and I was hoping to understand how that could happen. The woman I spoke to was polite and careful. She said she couldn't discuss specific cases, which I expected, but she did confirm, after I pressed gently, that their reports were occasionally requested by third parties with documented interest in a case. A grandparent, for example, could theoretically be listed as a secondary recipient if the person ordering the test requested it. Someone who wanted me to know had made sure I would know. Renata's baby shower was on a Saturday, 3 weeks after the letter arrived. 40 women, a rented hall in Westerville, pink and gold balloons. Daniel wasn't there, of course. It was women only. His sister organized it, everything done properly. I had been invited to stop by at the end to help load gifts into the car, which is how grandfathers participate in baby showers when they're in their 60s and have nowhere else to be on a Saturday afternoon. I almost didn't go. I stood in my kitchen that morning, the lab report back in my hands, and I thought about calling Daniel's sister and saying I wasn't feeling well. That would not have been entirely untrue. But I went, because if I didn't go, I would have to explain why. And I wasn't ready to explain anything yet. The hall smelled like candles and sandwiches. Renata was seated at the center of a long table when I arrived, surrounded by wrapping paper and ribbon, laughing at something her college roommate had just said. She was 7 months along, her hair pulled back, wearing a pale yellow dress. She looked healthy. She looked happy. She looked up and saw me and smiled, and it was a real smile, the kind that reaches a person's eyes before it reaches their mouth. "You came," she said. "Of course," I told her. We hugged carefully, the way you hug a very pregnant woman, and I carried 3 boxes of gifts to the car and drove home in silence and sat in my driveway for 20 minutes before going inside. I had made a decision. I just hadn't fully accepted it yet. I called Renata the following Thursday evening. Daniel was in Chicago for a work conference. I knew because he'd texted me a photo of the skyline from his hotel room that morning with the caption, "Wish you were here, Dad." I had saved the photo. I save most of the things my children send me. Renata picked up on the second ring. "Hey," she said, "everything okay?" "Everything's fine," I said. "I was wondering if I could come by this weekend. I have some things of Carol's that I wanted Renata to have for the nursery, a rocking chair, mostly, and some books." There was a pause. Brief, but there. "Of course," she said. "Sunday afternoon?" "Sunday's perfect," I told her. I spent Friday and Saturday pulling Carol's rocking chair out of the spare room and cleaning it properly. It had been in a corner under a blanket for 3 years. It was a good chair, solid oak, the kind of thing built to last longer than the people who use it. Carol had nursed both our children in that chair. I refinished it, touched up a few scratches with a matching stain. It took most of Saturday. I wasn't stalling. I was preparing. Sunday arrived gray and mild, the kind of October afternoon that can't decide if it wants to be fall or just the end of summer. I loaded the chair into my truck with the help of my neighbor, Harold, who is 72 and still insists on helping with heavy things despite his replaced hip. I didn't tell Harold why I seemed quiet. I don't tell Harold much. Renata was home alone when I pulled into their driveway. She met me at the door in a cardigan and socks, her feet swollen the way they get in the 3rd trimester. We brought the chair into the nursery, which was partially assembled, a crib against one wall, a changing table still in its box, a mobile hanging from the ceiling that turned slowly in the draft from the doorway. We sat in the kitchen afterward. She made tea. I watched her move around the kitchen, careful and unhurried, and I thought about how my son loved her, how he had called me the night they found out she was pregnant, his voice cracked and joyful in a way I hadn't heard from him since he was a teenager watching his baseball team win a tournament in the rain. I looked down at my tea. "Renata," I said, "someone sent me something. 3 weeks ago. I've been trying to figure out how to talk to you about it." She went still. Not startled, still. Not confused, still. Still in the way a person goes still when they've been waiting for something to arrive. "Okay," she said, quietly. "It was a paternity report," I said. "Prenatal, from a company called Bio Veritas." She set her mug down. Her hands were steady, which told me more than anything she could have said in that moment. "I need to ask you directly," I said, "because I'm not going to play games at this stage of my life, and I don't think you want me to. Is the baby Daniel's?" For a long moment, she didn't answer. She looked at the window above the sink, where a bird feeder Carol had picked out. I'd installed it there after Carol died because Daniel told me Renata liked birds, was swaying slightly in the wind. "No," she said. One word. The kitchen was very quiet. "No," she said again, as if once hadn't been enough to make it real. "He's not." What followed was not a screaming match. I want to be clear about that too, because I know what people expect when they hear a story like this. I am 63 years old. I have been a widower, a teacher, a father, a grandfather in waiting. I have sat with families at school conferences where the news was bad and the emotions were enormous, and I have learned over decades that the loudest response is rarely the most useful one. I asked her to tell me everything. She did. His name was Marcus. She had worked with him briefly at her firm 2 years earlier before he transferred to the Phoenix office. It had lasted 6 weeks. She had ended it. She had told herself it was finished and buried it, and continued her marriage and her life, and when she found out she was pregnant, she had allowed herself to assume, that it was Daniel's. It was only in her second trimester, when she had a routine genetic screening, that a secondary result had prompted her to do a private paternity test out of terror. The results had confirmed what she had been afraid to confirm. She had not told Daniel. She had been trying to figure out whether she would. She had been living with it since March. "Who sent me that letter?" I asked. She closed her eyes. "Marcus. I told him in July. I told him to go away and never contact me again. He must have. I don't know how he got your address. I don't know why he sent it to you and not to Daniel." I thought about that. A man in Phoenix deciding that the right person to blow up a family was the grandfather. Maybe he thought an old man would be easier to manipulate. Maybe he thought I would do his work for him and he could stay clean. I looked at my daughter-in-law, who was crying now, quietly, both hands resting on her stomach. I thought about my son in Chicago, sending me photos of the skyline. I thought about Carol, who was not alive to tell me what the right thing was, which meant I had to figure it out myself. I told Renata 3 things. The first was that she needed to tell Daniel before the baby came. Not after. Not when things were settled or easier. Before. Because a man deserves to know the truth about his own life before he is handed something that will reshape it permanently, and given him false certainty, and then taking it away later would be a cruelty I was not willing to be party to. She nodded. The second was that this was not a conversation I would have for her. Whatever Daniel's reaction was going to be, it needed to come from her mouth and be received without a mediator. I would be available to my son afterward, for as long as he needed, for whatever he needed. But the telling was hers to do. She nodded again. The third was that I was not going to tell her what decision to make about her marriage. That was not mine to make. What I would tell her was that I had watched my son become a man worth loving, and that whatever happened next, he deserved honesty more than he deserved comfort. She was crying openly by the time I finished. I handed her the box of tissues from the counter. I'd noticed it there when we came in, and I sat with her for a while longer. Before I left, she said, "I'm sorry, I'm so sorry, for all of it." "I know," I said, and I did know. Knowing didn't fix anything, but it was real, and real things matter, even the painful ones. Daniel called me on a Wednesday, 11 days later. I was in the backyard pulling up the last of the tomato steaks when my phone rang. I saw his name and set down the steaks carefully and answered. "Dad," he said. I knew from that single word. "I know," I said. "She told me a few weeks ago. I'm sorry I didn't call you sooner. I wanted to give her the chance to do it right." He was quiet for a long moment. I could hear him breathing. Outside, the neighbor's dog was barking at something in the hedge along the fence line. "Is she still there?" I asked. "At the house?" "Yes," he said. We're talking. We're trying to figure out." "Okay. I don't know what I'm going to do, Dad." "That's all right," I said. "You don't have to know yet." He asked me if I thought he was stupid for not seeing it. I told him that the people we love most are the people we are least equipped to be suspicious of, and that this wasn't a failure of intelligence. It was a function of trust. He said he wasn't sure if that made him feel better. I told him it wasn't supposed to make him feel better yet. It was just true. We talked for a long time. I walked slow circles around the backyard while we talked, the phone warm against my ear, the October air turning cool at the edges. At some point, I sat down on the back step where Carol used to sit to read in the evenings, the step worn smooth from years of that particular use. "What did you do?" he asked me, "when you found out, after you read that letter?" "I made coffee," I said, "and then I sat with it for 3 days before I did anything. 3 days. Some things need time before they become information. Right away, they're just shock." He said he understood that. I believed him. The baby was born in December. A boy, 8 pounds, 4 ounces, born at 6:14 in the morning at Riverside Methodist Hospital. Daniel was in the room. He called me 20 minutes after, and his voice had that same quality it had when he called me from the parking lot of the drugstore after Renata's positive test. Cracked open and full. "He's here, Dad," he said. "Tell me about him." He told me. He described the shape of the baby's hands and the sound of his first cry, and the way Renata looked after it was over, exhausted and relieved and something else Daniel didn't have a word for. He described the hospital room light and the nurse who had been kind, and the way time had moved differently once the baby arrived, slower and more deliberate, like someone had adjusted a setting. I sat in Carol's kitchen chair and listened to my son describe becoming a father, and I did not say anything for a long time except yes and tell me more. A legal process would follow, a paternity establishment, documentation, decisions about what name would go where and what the arrangement between Daniel and Renata and Marcus, still somewhere in Phoenix, still a variable in an equation no one had finished solving, would ultimately look like. None of that had been resolved by December. Most of it would take months longer. But on that morning, none of that was the most important thing. The most important thing was that my son was in a room where a child had just entered the world, and he was weeping with something that was not only grief, and he was calling me to share it. I drove to the hospital that afternoon. I brought Carol's rocking chair from the nursery, which I'd borrowed back after the conversation with Renata. She'd asked me to bring it back for the baby, and I had. I brought a small stuffed bear, brown and soft, the kind my wife would have chosen, When I arrived, Daniel was holding the baby by the window. The winter light was coming through in long, low angles, the way it does in December in Ohio, and it fell across the two of them and made everything look briefly still. My son looked at me over the baby's head. I walked over. He shifted the baby slightly, and I put my hand on that small back and felt the breathing, steady and new, the most reliable thing in the room. "He looks like your mother," I said, which was not entirely true, but was the truest thing I could think to say. Daniel laughed, a wet, tired laugh. "Yeah," he said, "he kind of does." We stood there at the window for a while. The city was gray and ordinary outside. In the hallway, nurses moved between rooms doing their ordinary work. Everything beyond that window was the same as it had been yesterday and would be tomorrow. But inside that room, a life had just started, which meant everything was also completely different. I didn't know how Daniel's marriage would end. I still don't, entirely, as I sit here telling you this. I don't know what arrangement will eventually be made, or what the boy will understand about his origins when he is old enough to ask, or how my son will feel about all of it in 5 years, 10, 20. I don't know what I would have done if I were younger and angrier and had less practice with sitting still inside hard things. What I know is this. Someone mailed me a letter to try to use me as a weapon, and I refused to be one. I know that my son needed the truth even when the truth was damaging, and that he received it from the right person in the right time, imperfect as that timing was. I know that a child was born into a complicated situation, and that the first hands to hold him included my sons, and that this is not nothing. This is not a small thing. I still have the lab report. It's in my copy of The Power Broker, exactly where I left it. I haven't decided whether to keep it or throw it away. Some days, I think I'll throw it away. Other days, I think there's a version of the future where the boy deserves to see it, to understand the whole shape of where he came from, and who knew, and what they chose to do. For now, it stays in the book. The coffee on my kitchen table is hot this morning. The house is quiet, but it's a different kind of quiet than it was before December. It has something waiting in it now, a direction. That's enough for today.